In this section, we go for a walk along the Hunter River and look at ways to revegetate to help stabilize the riverbanks.
Trying to get nodes of high quality established restoration happening is probably the best tactic, and finding the areas that will restore most readily. So often that's around where there is remnant native vegetation, but also pick your geomorphology. And so here you can actually see you've got a flat lower area of riverbank and also a more gentle slope. So if you're wanting to do a section, doing say 20 meters width all the way from top of bank down to the bottom here would be fairly easy to establish and easier to maintain. And then you might find there's another patch like that 50 meters on and gradually join those up. Because if you try to go to the hardest areas first, where there's going to be more erosion, more slumping, having to abseil down to put trees in the ground, it's always going to be harder. So getting these areas of success is good for morale, but also it means you're creating these low maintenance areas that can also help spread out into other patches. So this is actually an ideal place to start. And again, if you're looking at the idea, and I do encourage it, of doing it in sections. So doing complex jobs in strips while actually doing some stuff over the entire stretch. So you might want to plant out all your eucalypts behind the fence in one hit, but you then do full plantings in sections in the most stable areas, and then work into the less stable. This area is really good because, as you said, it's got a fairly mild slope. It's got good access, and also when you look at it, it's got a couple of patches of casuarina, so there's actually some good habitat to begin with, and so you can basically aim probably to join that with that. Yep. And so it's a logical place to work between. Once all this rots down, there's going to be more opportunity for erosion, just surface erosion. So even on slopes, mild slopes like this, is actually quite good to form terraces and plant behind the terraces. It does two things. It stops material like this falling downhill. So as that rots, it adds organic matter into the soil immediately behind, which also increases and improves the water holding capacity. So putting in small logs across the slope and just staking them in and planting immediately behind those helps establish the plants and also stops nutrients and organic matter from flowing away. One thing I was going to suggest too is a lot of these projects are beyond the capacity of individuals to do. So collective effort is often better. So as a group, you'll find that three people working on taking turns on each other's properties gets more than 3 times the work done. Just the enthusiasm of working together, many hands making light work, etc. But also, don't underestimate your potential here. You're close to Newcastle, you're close to Maitland. Have events, bring people up from the city to do events, and you need safe areas like this for them to do it in. Going to look at how putting in logs across the bank is good for stopping surface erosion and also helping with plantings. Usually you'd use bigger logs than this. I'd be arguing like Copper's log size is ideal, but for the purpose of demonstration, these are fine. We'll demonstrate planting with water crystals and these water bags, solid water, rechargeable solid water, and also just the planting technique. One thing that I usually say, which is probably a moot point here because the ground is so uneven, is usually when you plant plants, you try to have them in a little bowl or build a little ring around it so water can pond in there. And often in riverbanks, if you've got a relatively smooth bank, that can actually increase the turbulence and pull the trees out during flood. Here, it's such a convoluted bank anyway, I don't think it's going to have any issue. So, actually making a little ring of soil around to trap the water, or in this case, putting these logs down is probably not a bad idea. This is meant to be a sort of fairly passive, fairly short-term intervention. These will basically wash away every time it floods, but what you're trying to do is create conditions that are beneficial to plant establishment, so that your plants can actually get more likely to get established enough to withstand the floods before it floods. So as we said before, putting in this sort of terracing with logs, what it does is any surface flows during rain tend to accumulate behind and then get down into the soil. So it creates a moisture zone behind. It traps organic matter, which will rot, which again will allow more carbon into the soil. And because the soil tends to be moister behind them, if you've got worms, they'll actually take the organic matter down deeper into the soil. And so a simple thing as putting a log across can actually have multiple benefits for increasing the chance of survival of the plants. So obviously you just don't want to leave it there. It can roll down the hill. So the idea is just whack a couple of stakes in. Often's the case, you'll come back after a flood and the log's gone, but the stakes are still there. If the plants are established, you might take the stakes out and use them somewhere else because these will withstand, a few floods and last for a few years. One thing, especially if you're getting other people on your sites, is work health and safety. And often it's a good idea to spray paint these, a bit of fluoro paint on top, just so that if the grass grows high and you're walking down the bank, you don't trip over it. With larger logs, you might even want to wire them in. So put a drill hole through and just put a bit of tie wire around to hold them in place. Pocket planters. So as you can see, plants come in multiple types: forestry tubes and hycos. It's actually quite good to establish plants when they're quite young in the soil. The older the plant is, often the slower it establishes. So things like the hycos and forestry tubes are actually quite good. They're created in such a way that encourages the roots to grow downwards. In the old style round pots, you often got roots just going around and around. So this style of planting in these pots allows the roots to grow down so they penetrate fairly quickly in. It also means that you're not disturbing the soil, the root mass too much. In a lot of the older style pots, you break up the soil around the edge of the pot to break up that circular motion of the roots. And that actually set the plant back because it puts it into shock. This way you can put the plant in and there's no real transplant shock. So putting it in straight away. So these are a good way to plant. The long stem planting that I talked about before, you would have plants in forestry tubes, but the plants themselves might be 2 meters tall, 1.5 meters tall, and that you dig a hole with a water jet down 1.5 meters, and the plant would not only have that much sticking above the ground, but the actual root mass would be way down low. So we're looking for a shovel as we speak, but with planting with these tools, this one is set up specifically for hycos, and this one's got a cutout for the forestry tubes. Now, these are actually easier to use in non-sandy soil because sandy soil tends to collapse in on itself, but they're still functional. So what I'll do is I'll plant 2 or 3 along here. This is more for demonstration. This doesn't really demonstrate the type of planting you do if you're doing broad scale. By cutting down, wiggle, and remove, you've got the soil. This shows that revegetation is basically a cookie cutter exercise. Water crystals are often worthwhile using in these sort of situations because even though it's moist at the moment, you can get quite dry. The thing you want to do is you don't have a layer of pure water crystals. That could cause problems. So you basically, about a teaspoonful. No, I got one. So I'm just roughing it up so it gets incorporated into the soil a bit. Now, having it down lower encourages roots to actually go downwards. If you had a lot of it in the side, plants have what we call tropisms, behaviors. Plants' roots will move towards moisture areas. So if you had it in the side, you would encourage movement that way. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also good to have plants putting their roots down deep. So this one you can see by the fact the soil is quite loose, could have probably done another 6 or 8 weeks in the pot. Ideally, the roots would hold the soil together. But here it's relatively healthy. It's got a lot of root growth down below. Interestingly, it's got some roots growing upwards. That doesn't usually happen. There's this thing called geotropism, which makes roots go downwards. But when it's plants new, they sort of grow all over the place. And also, well, one other good thing, I'll put this in the ground and talk about it. Now the hole should be exactly the right height, and it is. To actually make sure that the soil in the cutout profile and the root mass is intact, you can basically press it down, stamp on it either side, and that will just make sure all the soil touches. And the beauty of what we have here, if you look at it, we have this perfect little natural depression. So any water flowing in will fill up that hole and keep it nice and wet and recharge the water crystals. So we'll try putting in one of the sandpaper figs. Again, just pinch. It's not really to make perfect conditions. This is all just to help a little bit. You know, you just increase the percentage chance of it doing well. So you can see this one's pretty much at the surface. So you might want to, because we're on a bit of depression, rough it up a bit more. Yeah, ideally you have a little depression. Here the log also does that. It'll, and also as this stuff washes down in wind and rain, it'll form a natural mulch. I'd say use no more digging. Usually on a river, you'd look at one woody plant every square metre and 4 herbaceous plants a square metre ultimately. Now that might mean there's a tree every 5 square metres and shrubs in between. So maybe tea tree, small wattle, but basically with revegetation, if you do like one woody per square metre and a few herbaceous around, the more the better. It's easier to overplant and have to cull rather than come back and fill in holes later on. So I'll show 2 things with the shoveling. One is, I mean, here you can see this soil has got an organic fraction, and also it's got some silts or possibly loams in there without doing a soil test. You can actually get a soil test kit pretty easily, which will tell you pH, but also what you do is you make a ball with it and squeeze it, and you can actually tell what the soil's made up of. The amount of sand, silt, loam, a medium-sized tree, chances are all the bacteria that in here have gone, and there'll be the right sort of bacteria in the soil. So obviously that's quite deep. We don't need it that deep. So what we're going to do is then backfill a bit. I'll put a little bit more in just for the hell of it. And so this plant bag, this tea bag of soil moisture, as saying what you're doing by building up the soil and packing it down each time, you're assuring that there's no voids in the soil, so that it doesn't dry out too much. And here now you've got the slight concavity, so it will top up with water whenever it rains. Mulching is also good. If you've got material like this, it doesn't hurt to actually just mulch around, because that stops the sun evaporating the surface water. But having logs here, and ideally, as I said, you'd have a larger log that will actually capture any organic material. And so what you'll find behind areas like this, you'll have more worm activity here, and carbon being moved through the soil and better water holding capacity. And look, once the plants are established, you can move the logs, or if you've got plenty around the property, it doesn't matter, you just set them up around the place, and if they wash away, they wash away.
Now we've got a combination of some native grass seed. We've got kangaroo grass, red grass, and green summer grass. And we've got the biocast liquid with the activator already pre-mixed in here. So what we want to do is just add this slowly. I'll get Roger to maybe hold that. And mix it into the seed so it creates a coating but doesn't saturate it. Just a little bit at a time, yeah. Yeah, that might be enough actually. It's already a bit wet. It's probably a little bit more than what we needed. So we just want to try to give this seed a good start to make contact with the soil and use those beneficial microbes to send down some root systems and provide more nutrient absorption for the grasses and establish quickly. I'd have to come back and reseed this later. Yeah, it's still a little bit sticky, just a bit. But that seed's going to go a long way.